The ancient peaks of Drakmor had not seen sunlight in 3 moons. Black clouds, thick as winter wool, churned above the mountain range where dragons had ruled unchallenged for millennia. Below in the Silverleaf Valley, the elven settlements flickered like dying candles, their once brilliant magical barriers growing weaker with each passing day. Lyralei Moonwhisper pressed her palm against the crystalline wardstone at the heart of Lumenspire, the greatest of the elven cities. The crystal's light pulsed weakly beneath her touch, its azure glow barely illuminating her worried features. As the youngest member of the High Council in Elven history, she bore a responsibility that would have crushed spirits twice her age. The barriers won't hold another fortnight, she whispered to herself, watching hairline cracks spider across the wardstone's surface. The ancient magic that had protected her people for 3,000 years was failing, and with it, their entire way of life hung in the balance. Above the perpetual storm clouds, Thoraxes the Emberborn circled the peaks of his ancestral domain. His scales, each one a masterwork of crimson and gold, caught what little light penetrated the magical darkness. At nearly 8 centuries old, he had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth of mountains, and the slow dance of continental drift. Yet never had he seen darkness like this. The shadow that consumed his realm was not natural. It moved with malevolent purpose, devouring light, warmth, and life itself. Already 2 of his younger kin had vanished into its depths, their roars of defiance cut short by something far more ancient and terrible than any dragon. The Void Wraiths had returned. Thoraxes banked sharply, his massive wings beating against air thick with unnatural cold. Legend spoke of these creatures from the time before time, when the world was young and the barriers between dimensions were thin. They were destroyers of worlds, consumers of reality itself, and they had been locked away by the combined might of all free peoples eons ago. Now someone or something had broken their prison. In the Elven archives deep beneath Lumenspire, Lyralei traced her finger along passages written in the old script, her emerald eyes reflecting the soft glow of preserved starlight that illuminated the ancient texts. The leather-bound tome before her was older than memory, its pages filled with accounts of the last Void War. "The Alliance of Light," she read aloud, her melodic voice echoing in the vast chamber. "United were the children of earth and sky, bound by necessity and tempered in the forge of ultimate darkness. Only through their sacrifice were the devourers banished beyond the Veil of Worlds." Her breath caught as she read the next passage. The alliance hadn't just been between elves and humans, as she'd always been taught. Dragons had fought alongside them, dragons like the ones her people now feared and mistrusted. A thunderous roar shattered the silence of the archives, so powerful that dust rained from the crystal ceiling. Lyralei's head snapped up as she heard something impossible, a dragon's call, but not one of rage or territorial challenge. This was a call of warning. Racing up the spiraling stairs that led to the surface, Lyralei emerged onto the highest balcony of the Spire of Voices. What she saw made her blood turn to ice in her veins. The darkness had descended from the mountains like a living avalanche, flowing down the slopes with tendrils of absolute void that consumed everything in their path. Trees withered to ash at its touch. Rivers boiled away to nothing. The very stone of the mountainside crumbled as if reality itself was being erased. But there, diving through the writhing mass of shadow, was a dragon unlike any she had ever seen. Crimson scales blazed like captured sunlight as he fought against creatures that seemed to be made of living darkness. Thoraxes battled with desperate fury, his flames carving tunnels of light through the void, but for every shadow he destroyed, 2 more took its place. Lyralei watched in amazement as the great dragon's fire began to dim. The Void Wraiths were draining his life force even as he fought them, their ethereal tendrils reaching into his very soul. In moments he would fall, and with him, the last hope of understanding what they truly faced. Without conscious thought, Lyralei began to weave magic with her hands, drawing upon power she had never dared to touch before. The ancient elvish words of the Great Summoning spilled from her lips as she reached into the deepest wells of her heritage. Light blazed from her fingertips, not the gentle radiance of elven magic, but something far more primal and dangerous. A pillar of pure starfire erupted from the balcony, piercing the darkness like a spear thrown by the gods themselves. The beam struck Thoraxes, but instead of burning him, it merged with his own inner flame. His scales blazed brilliant white as power beyond imagining flowed through him, and his roar of renewed fury shook the very foundations of the mountains. Empowered by elven starfire, Thoraxes became a living comet as he tore through the Void Wraiths. Each beat of his wings scattered their forms like smoke, and his breath weapon now burned with the light of creation itself. The shadows recoiled, their advance halted for the first time since their return. But the effort nearly killed Lyralei. She collapsed to her knees, her silver hair now streaked with premature white, blood trickling from her nose as the price of wielding such power made itself known. Through blurred vision, she watched as Thoraxes broke free from the shadow army and wheeled toward Lumenspire. He landed on the balcony with surprising gentleness for a creature of his size, his great head lowering until his amber eyes were level with hers. When he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder, yet somehow filled with warmth. "Little star singer," he rumbled, "you have saved not just my life, but perhaps all our people's. I am Thoraxes, guardian of the eastern peaks, and I find myself in your debt." Lyralei struggled to her feet, swaying as exhaustion threatened to claim her. "I am Lyralei of the Moonwhisper line, voice of the High Council. And we need each other's help, Great One. The Void Wraiths, they're not just attacking randomly. There's intelligence behind this, a purpose." Thoraxes nodded grimly. "I have felt it too. Something guides them, coordinates their assault. But what force could command such ancient evil?" Their answer came in the form of a vision that suddenly seized them both. The magical resonance created by their joined powers had opened a window into the shadow realm, and through it, they saw the truth that chilled them to their very souls. At the heart of the Void Army stood a figure that had once been Elven, but was now something far more terrible. Wrapped in shadows that moved like living things, with eyes that burned with the cold fire of dying stars, he raised a staff crowned with a crystal of pure darkness. This was Malachar the Fallen, once the greatest mage of the Third Age, now transformed into something that existed beyond death itself. "My old student," Thoraxes whispered, recognition and sorrow mixing in his ancient voice. "I taught him the words of power, showed him how to speak with the elements themselves. But his hunger for knowledge led him to forbidden paths." Lyralei stared at the vision in horror. "He's opened permanent gates to the Void Realm. The Wraiths aren't invading, they're being summoned in endless waves. He means to drain our world of all life and light to feed his transformation into something even more powerful." The vision faded, leaving them in the dim glow of the failing ward stones. Around them, they could hear the sounds of panic as other elves finally realized the true scope of the threat bearing down on them. "My people will never trust dragons," Lyralei said quietly. "Too many centuries of fear and misunderstanding." "And mine will never bow to elves," Thoraxes replied. "Pride runs deep in dragon blood. But perhaps—" He lifted his great head, studying her with eyes that held the wisdom of ages. "Perhaps trust can begin with just two souls who have already saved each other's lives." That night, as the Void Wraiths pressed closer to the outer barriers of Lumenspire, an unprecedented meeting took place in the Hall of Starlight. Lyralei stood before the High Council, her hands still trembling from the magical effort that had saved a dragon's life. The 7 eldest elves in the realm sat in their crystal thrones, their faces masks of ancient authority and barely contained fear. "You ask us to ally with dragons," spoke Sylvanas the Timeless, his voice carrying the weight of 4 millennia. "Creatures who have been our enemies since the dawn of recorded history, who burned our first cities and drove us into hiding in these valleys. The same creatures who fought beside us in the last Void War," Lyralei countered, producing the ancient tome she had discovered. "The same creatures who helped lock away these horrors in the first place. Our ancestors knew what we have forgotten, that some enemies are too great to face alone." Elder Moonweaver leaned forward, her silver eyes reflecting centuries of accumulated wisdom. "Even if what you say is true, child, how do you propose we coordinate with beings we cannot trust? Dragons are proud beyond measure, violent by nature. What makes you think they would honor any agreement?" Before Lyralei could answer, a shadow fell across the great crystal dome above them. Thoraxes descended slowly, his massive form visible through the transparent ceiling, as he landed with infinite care on the reinforced platform outside. His voice, amplified by ancient acoustic enchantments built into the dome itself, reached every corner of the hall. "I come not as conqueror or enemy," the great dragon declared, "but as one who has seen the true enemy we all face. My fire has been joined with your starlight, and in that joining I have felt the strength that once saved our world. Grant me parley, and I will show you visions of what awaits if we fail to stand together." The council exchanged glances, heavy with unspoken communication. Finally, Sylvanas nodded slowly. "Open the dome. Let the dragon enter, but under ward and binding." The crystal dome split along ancient seams, petals of starlight-infused glass folding back to admit Thoraxes. As he settled his massive bulk in the center of the hall, protective barriers shimmered to life around him. Not to cage him, Lyralei realized, but to protect the elves if something went wrong. "Speak then, Thoraxes of the dragons," Elder Moonweaver commanded. "Show us these visions you claim to possess." Thoraxes breathed gently, and from his nostrils came not flame, but wisps of golden light that danced in the air above the assembled council. The lights grew and merged, forming images that made several elves gasp in recognition and fear. They saw Malachar as he had been, a young elf consumed by curiosity about the nature of reality itself. They witnessed his discovery of the Void Gates, his first contact with the entities beyond, and his gradual corruption as he traded pieces of his soul for forbidden knowledge. They watched as he opened the first permanent breach between worlds and felt his twisted joy as the Void Wraiths poured through. But most chilling of all, they saw his ultimate plan, to drain the life force from every living thing in their world, using that energy to transform himself into a being capable of crossing between dimensions at will. He would become a wandering destroyer, moving from reality to reality, consuming entire universes to fuel his endless hunger for power. "He has already claimed 2 dragon peaks," Thoraxes said as the visions faded. "7 of my kin have fallen to his servants. Your barriers, impressive as they are, will not hold against what he has become. Alone, we are both doomed. Together," he paused, looking directly at Lyralei, "together we might forge a weapon capable of piercing the void itself." Councilor Starweave, the youngest of the elders at a mere 2,000 years, spoke for the first time. "What weapon could possibly stand against such power?" "The same one our ancestors used," Lyralei answered, understanding flooding through her. "The harmony of elements. Dragonfire merged with elven starlight, tempered by human willpower, and focused through dwarven crafting. But the humans are scattered to the far continents, and the mountain folk have sealed their halls." "Then we begin with what we have," Thoraxes rumbled. "Dragon flame and elven light. The harmony begins with harmony between us." The debate that followed raged through the night. Some counselors argued that allying with dragons would be trading one destroyer for another. Others insisted that the elven people should retreat deeper into their hidden sanctuaries and wait for the storm to pass. But as dawn approached, or what should have been dawn, though no sun could penetrate the void-shrouded sky, reports arrived that changed everything. Scout Captain Sylviana burst into the hall, her usually immaculate armor splattered with an oily substance that seemed to absorb light. "The outer settlements," she gasped. "Thornweald, Crystalbrook, Star Meadow, all gone. Not destroyed, my lords and ladies. Gone. As if they never existed. The void has consumed them completely." A chill silence fell over the hall. Those 3 settlements housed nearly 10,000 elves. Elder Sylvanas stood slowly, his ancient frame trembling with grief and rage. "Show us," he commanded. Lyralei joined the exodus to the observation deck, her heart heavy with dread. What she saw through the far-seeing crystals made her stomach lurch with horror. Where Thornweald had stood for over a millennium, there was simply nothing. Not ruins, not ash, not even bare earth. A perfectly circular void in reality itself, as if someone had used a cosmic blade to cut a hole in the world. "They're not just killing us," she whispered. "They're erasing us. Removing us from existence itself." Thoraxes had followed them to the deck, his great bulk somehow managing to fit through passages that should have been too small for him. "This is Malachar's true purpose," he said, his voice heavy with ancient sorrow. "He doesn't merely seek power, he seeks to become the sole consciousness in existence. Every life he erases adds to his strength while removing potential opposition." Elder Moonweaver turned to face the dragon directly. "If we ally with you, what assurance do we have that you won't simply claim our lands once the immediate threat is past? Dragons are not known for their restraint in matters of territory." Thoraxes was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute sincerity. "I will submit to a binding oath witnessed by the stars themselves. Should I or any who follow me betray this alliance once the void threat is ended, may our flames be forever extinguished, and our names struck from the dragon song of memory." The elves exchanged glances of amazement. For a dragon to offer such an oath was unprecedented. Their names and deeds were literally their immortality, preserved in the great song that every dragon learned from birth. "And what do you ask of us in return?" Sylvanas inquired. "Trust," Thoraxes replied simply, "and the knowledge your people have preserved. The void can only be fought with understanding, and your archives contain wisdom my kind has forgotten." Lyralei stepped forward. "I propose myself as liaison," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was suggesting. The magical resonance between Thoraxes and myself has already proven effective against the void. If we can learn to work together, we might discover how to teach others. Absolutely not, snapped Councilor Starweave. You're far too valuable to risk. I'm the only one who's successfully channeled power through a dragon, Lyralei interrupted, and Thoraxes is the only dragon who's survived direct contact with the Void Wraiths. If there's a chance we can turn this connection into something larger, we have to try. The council voted as the artificial night deepened around them. By the narrowest possible margin, 4 voices to 3, they agreed to the alliance. But their decision came with strict conditions. The partnership would be limited to the current crisis, Thoraxes would submit to magical monitoring, and Lyralei would report back every day on their progress. As the great dragon departed to gather what remained of his scattered kin, Lyralei found herself alone on the observation deck, staring out at the advancing wall of void. Tomorrow she would begin working more closely with a dragon than any elf had in recorded history. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange sense of anticipation. The next morning brought their first real test. Thoraxes arrived with 3 other dragons, his sister Paralis the Stormcaller, the ancient goldworm Abraxas, and young Scarlet-Wing Firion, barely past his first century. They landed in the Great Plaza, their combined presence drawing every elf in the city to windows and balconies. Your people stare at us like we're mythical creatures, Paralis observed, amusement coloring her mental voice as she spoke directly to Lyralei's mind. To most of them you are, Lyralei replied, still startled by the intimate nature of dragon telepathy. We've had no contact for over 1,000 years. Abraxas, whose golden scales seemed to capture and hold sunlight that no longer existed, turned his great head toward her. And whose choice was that, little star singer? We offered parley many times over the centuries. Your people chose isolation. Because the last time we trusted dragons, Virathan the Blackheart burned half of Silverleaf Valley, Lyralei shot back, then immediately regretted her sharp tone. But Abraxas surprised her by chuckling, a sound like distant thunder mixed with wind chimes. Ah yes, Virathan. We exiled him for that transgression. He broke the ancient codes that govern our conduct. Perhaps your historians failed to mention that detail? Before their conversation could continue, a new crisis emerged. Scout Captain Sylviana approached at a run, her face pale with fresh terror. Lady Lyralei! The void has begun moving again. It's not advancing slowly anymore, it's racing directly toward us. At its current speed, it will reach the outer barriers within hours. Lyralei felt ice form in her stomach. That's impossible. Malachar needs time to consolidate his gains, to process the life energy he's absorbed. Unless he's finished the ritual, Thoraxes interrupted, his mental voice cutting through her thoughts like a blade. The transformation he's been working toward. If he's achieved it, then he no longer needs to be cautious, Abraxas finished. He has become something beyond our understanding of power. The evacuation of Lumenspire began immediately, but everyone involved knew it was hopeless. Where could they flee that the void couldn't follow? The outer settlements were already gone, and the mountain passes were choked with Malachar's servants. There is another way, Firion spoke for the first time, his young voice carrying a note of desperate hope. The old stories speak of a place beneath the mountains, a sanctuary built in the first days after the world's shaping. The Hall of Echoes, where the first alliance was forged. Paralis turned sharply to her young companion. That place is legend, hatchling. Even if it exists, none know its location. I do. The voice came from an unexpected source, Elder Moonweaver, who had approached their gathering with surprising stealth. The secret has been passed down through my family line for 100 generations. The Hall of Echoes lies beneath Mount Celestine, accessible only through the Singing Caves. Lyralei stared at the ancient elf in amazement. You've known all along that there was a place we could retreat to? Not retreat, Moonweaver corrected. Stand and fight. The hall was built as more than a sanctuary. It was designed as a focus point for the kind of magic our ancestors used to banish the void. But it requires the willing cooperation of all the free peoples, and most of those peoples no longer exist. Thoraxes lowered his great head until he was eye level with the elder. What do you need from us? Everything, Moonweaver replied simply. Your fire, your life force, your very essence must be freely given to power the ancient mechanisms. The same from my people. And if we're fortunate enough to contact the scattered human tribes and the deep-dwelling dwarves, their sacrifice as well. Sacrifice? Lyralei asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The void can only be banished by creating a counterforce of equal magnitude, Moonweaver explained. pure creation opposing pure destruction. To generate such power requires. She paused, her ancient features creased with sorrow. It requires that we burn ourselves as fuel for the working. Not all will survive. A heavy silence fell over the group as the implications sank in. They were discussing not just an alliance, but a suicide mission that might not even succeed. Young Firion was the first to speak. Then we die for something greater than ourselves. Is that not what heroes do? His simple words broke the paralysis that had gripped them all. One by one, dragon and elf alike, they began to nod. The evacuation continues, Lyralei declared, but not to flee, to gather at Mount Celestine. Send word to every settlement, every outpost. If any of the mountain folk still live, if any human tribes remain in the eastern lands, call them to the Hall of Echoes. And if they refuse? Scarlet asked. Thoraxes spread his wings, the gesture somehow conveying both majesty and grim determination. Then we few will do what we can, and hope it is enough. The journey to Mount Celestine became a running battle. The void pursued them like a living thing, flowing across the landscape in defiance of natural law. Malakar's servants, no longer just wraiths but twisted amalgamations of shadow and stolen life force, harried the fleeing elves at every turn. It was here that the alliance truly began to take shape. When Void Spawn ambushed the refugee column in Thornwall Pass, Paralis and a company of elven battle mages fought side by side, her lightning coordinating perfectly with their combat spells. When the rear guard was overwhelmed at the Crossing of Sorrows, Abraxas dove from the sky while elven archers provided covering fire, their arrows somehow finding targets even in the chaos of aerial combat. But it was the partnership between Lyralei and Thoraxes that proved most effective. They had discovered that their magical resonance allowed them to share not just power but perception. Through Thoraxes, Lyralei could see the battlefield from above, coordinating ground forces with impossible precision. Through Lyralei, Thoraxes could sense the subtle flows of magic that revealed void spawn weaknesses invisible to dragon sight. You fight like you've trained together for decades, Firion observed during a brief rest in the Whispering Woods. In a way, we have, Lyralei replied, though she didn't fully understand her own words. The connection she shared with Thoraxes felt ancient, as if they were rediscovering something that had always existed rather than forging something new. Their convoy was swelled by survivors from other settlements. Nearly 20,000 elves now followed them toward the uncertain sanctuary of Mount Celestine. But they also gained more unexpected allies. A band of dwarven refugees emerged from hidden tunnels in the Ironroot Hills, led by Thane Ironforge himself. And most surprising of all, a delegation of human wanderers arrived from the eastern steppes, their shamans claiming to have received prophetic dreams calling them to this place. The old blood remembers, explained Kessera Stormdancer, the human tribal leader. Our great-grandparents spoke of the Void Wars, of the time when all peoples stood as one. The spirits of our ancestors cry out for us to honor those ancient bonds. Thane Ironforge, his braided beard gray with centuries of mountain dust, clasped hands with both Thoraxes and Lyralei. The deep halls echo with more than hammer song these days, he rumbled. Something stirs in the darkness below, and it's not of this world. If the old enemy has truly returned, then the old alliances must be renewed. By the time they reached Mount Celestine, their force had grown beyond all expectation. Nearly 30,000 souls now gathered at the base of the sacred peak. Elves, humans, dwarves, and 4 dragons whose combined presence seemed to make the very air shimmer with potential. The entrance to the Singing Caves was hidden behind a waterfall that had run clear for millennia, but now flowed black with void taint. Elder Moonweaver pressed her hand to a seemingly ordinary stone, speaking words in the first tongue that predated written history. The stone sang in response, a pure, crystalline note that made the waterfall part like a curtain, revealing passages carved from living crystal. The Hall of Echoes lies at the mountain's heart, Moonweaver explained as they began their descent. But the path is treacherous, and not all who enter will reach the final chamber. The mountain itself will test us. She was not exaggerating. The Singing Caves earned their name from the way sound behaved within them. Whispers became roars, footsteps echoed for minutes, and sometimes voices from the past seemed to speak from the crystal walls. But more than acoustics challenged the alliance. The passages themselves seemed to shift and change, testing the resolve and unity of those who walked them. When the path split into 3 branches, it was Thane Ironforge who found the solution. The mountain asks us to choose our path based on our nature, he said, studying dwarvish runes carved into the stone. But we are no longer separate peoples. We go forward as one, or not at all. Together they carved a fourth passage through the living stone, dragon fire providing heat, elven magic shaping the work, human willpower driving them forward, and dwarven skill guiding their tools. The mountain seemed to approve, for the new tunnel sang with harmonious notes that guided them ever deeper. The Hall of Echoes, when they finally reached it, defied description. Vast beyond measure, its walls were made of crystallized starlight that captured and held the glow of every flame, every spell, every living soul that entered. At the chamber's center stood an altar older than civilization, surrounded by concentric circles of carved symbols representing each of the free peoples. Magnificent, breathed Abraxas. I had thought it legend, but this rivals even the greatest of dragon hordes. It's more than beautiful, Lyralei whispered, her magical senses overwhelmed by the power contained within the chamber. It's a focusing lens for reality itself. Whatever working is performed here will echo across the entire world. But even as they marveled at the ancient sanctuary, urgent news arrived from their rear guard. The void had reached the base of Mount Celestine and was beginning to flow upward like a tide of liquid darkness. They had perhaps an hour before it reached the Hall of Echoes. Then we begin immediately, declared Elder Moonweaver, her voice carrying new authority as she took on the role of ritual leader. The working requires willing sacrifice from each people. Who will speak for the dragons? I will, Thoraxes replied without hesitation. And for the humans? Kasara Stormdancer stepped forward. The spirits have chosen me. For the dwarves? Thane Ironforge nodded grimly. My clan has guarded these deep places for 3,000 years. It ends with me. And for the elves, Moonweaver continued, the choice falls to our youngest councilor, she who first reached across the divide between our peoples. Lyralei felt the weight of destiny settle on her shoulders like a mantle made of starlight. I accept the responsibility. The ritual that followed was unlike anything in recorded history. As the four representatives took their places around the ancient altar, the carved symbols began to glow with their own inner light. The entire chamber resonated like a vast musical instrument, its song calling out to powers older than memory. But the working required more than symbolic gestures. Each representative had to offer something precious beyond measure, not gold or gems, but aspects of their very identity. Thane Ironforge placed his ancestral warhammer on the altar and spoke the words that would sever his connection to the deep places he had guarded all his life. The hammer cracked and crumbled, its essence flowing into the growing matrix of power. Kasara Stormdancer offered her shaman's staff and the spiritual bond that connected her to the wandering spirits of her people. The staff burst into flame that was not fire, its substance becoming pure will made manifest. Thoraxes lowered his great head and breathed upon the altar, but what emerged was not flame. It was the dragon song of memory itself, the collective knowledge and wisdom of his entire species. The sacrifice nearly drove him to his knees, for a dragon without his memory song was barely more than a clever beast. Finally, Lyralei stepped forward and placed her hands upon the altar. What she offered was the hardest sacrifice of all, her connection to the starlight that was the source of all elven magic. The light flowed from her fingers like silver blood, leaving her feeling hollow and empty. But their individual sacrifices were only the beginning. As the power built within the chamber, something unprecedented happened. The barriers between their separate magics began to dissolve, creating something entirely new. Dragon fire merged with elven starlight, human willpower fused with dwarven craftsmanship, and from their union arose a force that sang with the voice of creation itself. Now, Moonweaver commanded, join your essences. Become the weapon that can pierce the void. What followed transcended physical reality. Lyralei felt her consciousness expand beyond her body, touching and merging with the minds of her companions. Through Thoraxes, she experienced the vast patience of geological time and the fierce joy of flight. Through Kasara, she felt the endless wandering of the human spirit and its refusal to accept defeat. Through Ironforge, she knew the deep satisfaction of crafting something beautiful and permanent from raw materials. And they, in turn, experienced her perspective, the careful balance that allowed elves to shape reality through will and wisdom, the long view that comes from near immortality, the deep love of growing things and the preservation of beauty. Together they became something greater than the sum of their parts. The weapon they forged was not made of metal or magic alone, but of understanding itself, the recognition that all life was connected, that diversity was strength, and that the greatest power came not from domination, but from willing cooperation. The void reached the Hall of Echoes just as their working reached its crescendo. Malachar himself flowed into the chamber, no longer recognizable as having ever been Elven. He had become a walking tear in reality, a hunger given form and consciousness. "You think your little alliance can stand against eternity?" His voice was the sound of dying stars. "I have consumed galaxies, little insects. I am become inevitability itself." But when he struck at them with tendrils of pure negation, the weapon they had become did not shatter. Instead, it absorbed his assault and transformed it, turning destruction back into potential, negation into affirmation. For the first time since his transformation, Malachar felt something he had forgotten was possible: doubt. "Impossible," he whispered. "Nothing can stand against the void. I have seen civilizations fall like wheat before the scythe." "You have forgotten something crucial," Lyralei replied, and her voice now carried harmonics of dragon song, human determination, and dwarven certainty. "The void can only destroy what already exists. But we are creating something new." The battle that followed was fought on levels beyond the physical. Reality warped and twisted as two fundamental forces, creation and destruction, met in direct opposition. Mountains moved, time flowed backward, and for brief moments, the laws of existence themselves hung in the balance. But gradually, inexorably, the alliance began to prevail. Each time Malachar sought to erase them from existence, they responded by creating something new and beautiful. Each negation was met with affirmation, each darkness with light, each despair with hope. The turning point came when Malachar, in his growing desperation, attempted to drain the life force from every living thing within 100 leagues. It was the same tactic he had used to consume the outer settlements, and it should have been unstoppable. Instead, the Alliance opened themselves as conduits, allowing the stolen life energy to flow through them and back to its sources. The dead elves of Thornweald, Crystalbrook, and Starmeadow suddenly stood again in the Hall of Echoes, their existence restored by an act of collective will that transcended individual mortality. "You see," Thoraxes said, his voice now harmonizing with thousands of others, "we have learned the secret you never understood. True power comes not from taking, but from giving. Not from standing alone, but from standing together." Malachar's form began to unravel as the fundamental contradiction at his core finally tore him apart. He had sought to become the sole consciousness in existence, but consciousness requires others to be conscious of. In achieving his goal, he would have negated his own existence. "This is not possible," he screamed as the void energies he had bound to himself began to slip away. "I am eternal. I am inevitable." "You are alone," Lyralei said simply, "and that is why you have already lost." The final working required one last sacrifice: the Alliance itself. The four representatives, still joined at levels beyond the physical, poured their combined essence into a construct of pure creation. It took the form of a tree whose roots touched every dimension, whose branches supported infinite realities, whose leaves were made of crystallized hope. The tree of infinite becoming struck root in the Hall of Echoes and immediately began to grow. Its branches pierced through dimensional barriers, its roots anchored reality itself, and its presence made Malachar's void energies simply irrelevant. As the fallen mage's form finally dissipated into nothingness, the darkness that had plagued their world for so long began to recede. Sunlight, real sunlight, streamed down through the mountain's peak, illuminating the Hall of Echoes with natural radiance for the first time in months. But victory came at a price. The four representatives found themselves forever changed by what they had experienced. They remained linked at levels deeper than thought, their individual identities enriched by their connection to each other. "So," Abraxas said as they emerged into the morning light, "what happens now? We have saved the world, but can we save ourselves from returning to the old ways of suspicion and isolation?" It was young Firion who provided the answer. "We have created something new," he said, gesturing to where representatives of all four peoples worked together to tend the wounded and rebuild what had been lost. "Look around you." Elven healers work alongside human shamans. Dragonfire helps dwarven smiths forge tools for reconstruction. We are no longer separate peoples who occasionally cooperate. We have become something unprecedented. In the days that followed, the truth of his words became apparent. The alliance forged in desperate necessity had created bonds that would not easily break. Elven magic now carried traces of dragonfire. Human shamans found their spells strengthened by dwarven precision. Dragons discovered that their hoarded knowledge grew more valuable when shared. A month later, as Lyralei stood on the restored balcony of Lumenspire, she watched something that would have been impossible just a season before. In the plaza below, young elves learned flight from dragon instructors, while dragon hatchlings studied the subtleties of magical theory from elven masters. Human and dwarven children played together in games that combined the best traditions of both peoples. Regrets? Thoraxes asked, landing beside her with the casual ease that had become natural between them. Lyralei considered the question seriously. She had given up her connection to the pure starlight that had been the foundation of elven magic for millennia. In its place, she now wielded something more complex: starfire tempered by dragon flame, guided by human intuition, and grounded in dwarven practicality. Different, certainly. Weaker? Not at all. None, she said finally. We set out to save our peoples, and instead we created a new people, one that honors the best of all our traditions while building something unprecedented. The Alliance will face challenges, Thoraxes warned. There are still those among all our kinds who prefer the old ways of separation and mistrust. Then we'll face those challenges together, Lyralei replied, just as we face the void. As if summoned by their words, Cassara Stormdancer and Thane Ironforge approached across the plaza, accompanied by a delegation of younger representatives from their peoples. The future leaders of the Alliance, already working together with an ease their elders still found miraculous. The Council of Voices meets tonight, Cassara announced. The agenda is ambitious, establishing trade routes that benefit all peoples, creating mixed settlements where any who wish can live in harmony, and founding a new order of guardians trained in all our traditions. And, added Ironforge with a crafty grin, deciding what to do with the Tree of Infinite Becoming. Something that powerful shouldn't be left unattended, but it's grown beyond any one people's ability to manage. Lyralei exchanged glances with Thoraxes. They had discussed this very issue the night before. Joint custody, she said. Representatives from each people serving in rotation, ensuring that no one group gains too much influence over something that belongs to all of us. Shared responsibility, Thoraxes agreed. The same principle that saved us will guide us going forward. As the sun set over Silverleaf Valley, the first natural sunset they had seen in months, the four original Alliance leaders climbed once more to the Hall of Echoes. The Tree of Infinite Becoming had continued to grow, its trunk now spanning the entire chamber, its branches extending into dimensions they could barely perceive. But more than its size had changed. The tree now bore fruit, crystalline pods that contained possibilities. Each pod held the potential for something unprecedented, something that had never existed before. New forms of magic, new ways of thinking, new solutions to problems that had plagued the world since its creation. The tree gives us gifts, Elder Moonweaver observed, but it also poses questions. How do we decide which possibilities to nurture? How do we prevent the power within these fruits from corrupting those who would use them? The same way we prevented our alliance from collapsing into chaos, Lyralei answered. Together, with wisdom drawn from all our traditions, with safeguards built into every decision, with the understanding that power shared is power strengthened. She reached out and touched one of the crystalline fruits and immediately understood what it contained. The potential for a new form of communication that would allow instant understanding between any intelligent beings, regardless of species or culture. The end of misunderstanding, the beginning of true empathy. This one, she said, this is where we begin. In the weeks that followed, as the Alliance of Light, as they had come to call themselves, worked to implement the gift of understanding, other changes rippled outward from Mount Celestine. Settlements that had been abandoned during the Void crisis were reoccupied, but not as they had been before. The new communities were integrated from their founding, with elven tree shapers working alongside dwarven architects and human community planners, while dragons provided perspective and protection from above. Trade flourished as barriers of language and mistrust fell away. Elven star silver combined with dwarven steel to create alloys stronger than either metal alone. Human mobility and adaptability helped spread innovations across vast distances, while dragonflight created trade routes that spanned continents in days rather than months. But perhaps the most significant change was in the young. Children born after the Alliance had no memory of the old prejudices. To them it seemed perfectly natural that their friends might breathe fire, live for centuries, speak to spirits, or craft wonders from living stone. They were growing up as citizens of a truly integrated world. We have given them a gift beyond measure, Cassara observed as she watched human, elven, and dwarven children learn aerial maneuvers from young Firion, a world where difference is celebrated rather than feared. And a burden, added Ironforge. They will have to maintain what we have built, improve upon it, and pass it on to their own young. The Alliance must survive beyond us, or all our sacrifice will have been meaningless. Lyralei nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility they had placed on future generations. But as she watched the children below, laughing together as they learned to trust a dragon's claws to carry them safely through the sky, she felt hope rather than fear. They will do better than we did, she said with quiet confidence. They will build alliances we can't even imagine, solve problems we don't know exist yet. We gave them the tools and the foundation. What they build with them will exceed our greatest dreams. 6 months after the Battle of the Hall of Echoes, as historians were already calling it, the first great celebration of Alliance Day took place. Representatives from every settled region of the world gathered in what had once been Lumenspire but was now called Haven, a city that belonged to no single people but to all of them. The festival lasted for a week and featured exhibitions of integrated magic, demonstrations of cross-cultural craftsmanship, competitions that required mixed teams, and artistic performances that blended traditions in ways that would have been impossible before the Alliance. But the highlight was the ceremony of remembrance, held at dawn on the final day. The 4 original Alliance leaders stood once more around an altar, not the ancient stone of the Hall of Echoes, but a new creation carved from materials donated by every member people. Upon it burned a flame that would never die, fed by magic from all traditions, tended by guardians sworn to represent all peoples equally. Let this flame remind us, Lyralei spoke to the thousands gathered in the plaza, her voice carried by both elven acoustics and dwarven engineering to every corner of the crowd. That darkness can only prevail when light stands divided. Together there is no shadow we cannot dispel, no challenge we cannot overcome, no dream we cannot achieve. Thoraxes spread his wings above the crowd, his voice joining hers in harmony that had become as natural as breathing. Let this flame remind us that strength comes not from the power to destroy, but from the willingness to create. Not from the ability to stand alone, but from the wisdom to stand together. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, the 4 original leaders found themselves alone once more at the altar. The eternal flame danced before them, its light reflecting off surfaces of crystal, metal, and scale. "Do you think it will last?" Firion asked. Though still young by dragon standards, his role in the Alliance had aged him beyond his years. "The unity we've built, will it survive the test of time?" "Nothing lasts forever unchanged," Abraxas replied with the wisdom of his millennia. "But the best creations evolve rather than simply enduring. Our alliance will become something we can't imagine, will face challenges we've never dreamed of. But the foundation we've laid, the understanding that diversity is strength, that cooperation is wisdom, that will endure." Lyralei placed her hand on the altar, feeling the warmth of the eternal flame. In its light, she could see traces of the tree of infinite becoming still growing in the Hall of Echoes, still producing possibilities that would shape the future in ways they were only beginning to understand. "The void taught us something important," she mused. "It showed us that the greatest evil comes not from malice, but from the desire to be alone in existence. As long as we remember that lesson, as long as we choose connection over isolation, the Alliance will survive in some form." As they prepared to leave, Kasara paused at the altar's edge. "There's something else," she said, her shaman's senses detecting currents her companions might have missed. "The tree isn't just producing possibilities for us. Its influence is spreading beyond our world, touching other realities, other dimensions. Somewhere else, other peoples are learning to stand together against their own darkness." "As it should be," Thoraxes rumbled with satisfaction. "The best gifts are those that keep giving, long after the giver is forgotten." They departed as the sun reached its zenith, each returning to their responsibilities in the growing alliance. But they carried with them the knowledge that they had achieved something unprecedented in the history of their world. They had turned the greatest crisis their civilization had ever faced into the foundation for its greatest triumph. In the years that followed, the Alliance of Light would face other challenges. There would be natural disasters that required all their combined skills to overcome, political disagreements that tested their unity, and external threats from forces they had not yet imagined. But they would face them together, as partners and friends, as members of a family that transcended species and culture. And in the Hall of Echoes, the tree of infinite becoming continued to grow, its branches now extending into realities so distant that their light took eons to return. Each new possibility it produced was carefully studied, wisely chosen, and lovingly implemented by guardians who understood that the greatest power was not the ability to take whatever they wanted, but the wisdom to take only what was needed. The alliance had begun in desperation and necessity, but it would endure because it had grown into something far more precious, a true communion of souls who had learned that the secret to defeating the void was not to fill it with light, but to fill it with each other. And in the end, that made all the difference. High above the clouds that wreathed Mount Celestine, an ancient dragon circled on wings that had seen the rise and fall of empires. Thoraxes the Emberborn was now the eldest of his kind, his scales bearing the patina of ages, his eyes holding memories that spanned geological epochs. Below him, the world had changed beyond recognition. Cities floated in the sky, their foundations built from crystallized starlight and dreams made manifest. Forests grew in patterns too perfect to be natural, shaped by the patient collaboration of elven tree singers and dwarven earth shapers working in harmony across centuries. Rivers flowed uphill where they needed to, and deserts bloomed with flowers that drew their water from the morning dew. But the greatest change was in the people themselves. The distinctions between elf, human, dwarf, and dragon had not disappeared. Each kindred had retained their unique gifts and perspectives. But they had also grown beyond their original limitations. Elves had learned to embrace change and growth. Humans had discovered patience and long-term thinking. Dwarves had expanded their vision beyond the deep places to encompass the infinite sky. And dragons had discovered that the greatest hoards were not made of gold and gems, but of relationships and shared experiences. Landing on his favorite perch, a crystal platform that jutted from the mountain's peak like a frozen waterfall, Thoraxes settled his ancient bones and allowed his mind to drift back through the centuries. He remembered the terror of that first night when the void had seemed unstoppable, the desperate hope of their first alliance, the joy of discovering that their unity was stronger than any force arrayed against it. A familiar presence touched his consciousness, and he opened one great eye to see Lyralei approaching along the crystal bridge that connected his perch to the renovated Hall of Echoes. She moved with the same grace she had possessed a millennium ago, though her silver hair now held strands of every color of light, and her eyes reflected depths that had not existed in the young elf who had first dared to trust a dragon. "Reminiscing again, old friend?" she asked, settling beside him with the casual intimacy of 1,000 years of friendship. "The young ones are calling for another expansion," Thoraxes rumbled, amusement coloring his mental voice. "They've grown tired of having only one reality to explore and want to extend the alliance to the neighboring dimensions." Lyralei laughed, the sound like silver bells mixed with dragon song. "Let me guess. Firion is leading the expedition?" "Of course. That hatchling never did learn proper caution." Thoraxes' tone was fond rather than critical, though I suppose hatchling is hardly appropriate for someone approaching his second millennium. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun set over a world that bore little resemblance to the one they had fought to save so long ago. But the changes had not come through conquest or domination. Every transformation had been achieved through consensus. Every innovation implemented only after careful consideration of its impact on all life. The tree of infinite becoming still grew in the depths of Mount Celestine, though it had long since transcended its original chamber. Its roots now extended through multiple dimensions, its branches supported realities beyond counting, and its fruit had seeded new forms of existence throughout the multiverse. "Do you ever regret it?" Lyralei asked suddenly. "Giving up the old ways, the simple certainties? When we were enemies, at least we knew where we stood." Thoraxes considered the question seriously, as he always did her deeper inquiries. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," he admitted. "There was a purity to the old conflicts, a clarity that's been lost in all this cooperation and understanding." He paused, watching a group of young people practice aerial maneuvers in the distance, elves, humans, dwarves, and dragons working together with perfect coordination. "But then I see what we've built, and I remember why it was worth the sacrifice." "The children don't even understand what we gave up," Lyralei observed. "To them, this unity has always existed. They can't imagine a world where their friends would be enemies simply because of their species." "Good," Thoraxes said firmly. "That's exactly as it should be. Each generation should surpass the one before it, should be unable to imagine returning to the limitations their ancestors accepted." A new voice joined their conversation as Kasara Stormdancer materialized from the evening shadows. Her human heritage now mixed with so many other influences that she seemed to shift between forms depending on the light. "The Council of Voices is in session," she announced. "They're debating the ethics of creating new forms of consciousness using fruit from the tree." "Ah," Lyralei sighed. "The quarterly crisis. What's the objection this time?" The usual concerns about playing with forces beyond our understanding, Thane Ironforge added as he emerged from a tunnel that hadn't been there moments before. Dwarven space-folding technology had come a long way over the centuries. Though honestly, considering what we've already accomplished, it seems a bit late to start worrying about hubris. The four original Alliance leaders looked at each other and burst into laughter that echoed across the mountain peaks. After 1,000 years, they had become something beyond their original species. Not quite human, elf, dwarf, or dragon, but not quite something else either. They were living bridges between past and future, guardians of memory and shepherds of possibility. Should we go mediate? Thoraxes asked without much enthusiasm. In a moment, Lyralei replied. First, let's just remember. They closed their eyes and opened their minds to each other, sharing memories as they had learned to do in the Hall of Echoes so long ago. They relived the terror and hope of those first desperate days, the joy of discovering that their unity was stronger than their fears, the satisfaction of watching their alliance grow from desperate necessity into willing partnership into something approaching family. But they also shared visions of the future, the possibilities they could see approaching like distant storms. There were challenges ahead that would test the Alliance in ways they had never been tested before. Other realities where void-touched entities still roamed free. Decisions about the nature of consciousness itself that would require wisdom they had not yet developed. The eternal question of how to maintain unity while encouraging growth, how to preserve what was precious while remaining open to change. Ready? Lyralei asked as they opened their eyes. Always, Thoraxes rumbled. Together the four walked toward the Hall of Echoes, where their descendants, biological and spiritual, continued the work of building something unprecedented. Behind them, the eternal flame burned bright against the darkening sky, fed by magic from a dozen different traditions, tended by guardians who understood that the greatest treasures were those that grew more valuable when shared. And in the depths of Mount Celestine, the tree of infinite becoming rustled its interdimensional leaves and prepared to offer the next gift that would shape their world's destiny. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had learned to face everything else, together. The Alliance had begun with dragons and elves learning to trust each other against impossible odds. It had grown beyond anything its founders could have imagined, spreading across realities and dimensions, taking root in places where different forms of consciousness learned to see beyond their own limitations. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been. The simple recognition that no one is strong enough to stand alone against the darkness, but everyone is valuable when they choose to stand together in the light. And that, perhaps, was the greatest magic of all.